Hello, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So, welcome to my farewell to Percy Bysshe Shelley, because it's the bicentenary of his death today. Perhaps at the hour, is it to the minute, is it to the second, who knows? But it was in the afternoon of the 8th of July, 1822, when Percy Shelley was sailing on his yacht with three other Britons across the Gulf of Lerici. They set sail from Livorno, a Leghorn, as it's sometimes known in English, wanting to sail north towards San Terzeno, towards his house, Villamagni. They never made it. A sudden squall sank their boat. His yacht was rather top-heavy. He'd rigged it with an extra mast to make it faster. He was racing against Lord Byron's boat, the Bolivar. Anyway, he never made it. And here I am oppositely in Italy, looking out over this Florentine countryside. But it's so bright. The blazing light is almost blinding. So that was it. He was lost. The other three men on the boat, they also died. But was it a tempest that cost them their lives? Was it the fact that Shelley was perhaps perusing a copy of Keats's Lamia? I don't think so. In a storm, he might have had his hands full trying to deal with the sails. Supposedly, an Italian boat came up to them and offered to rescue them, saying, "Come to us," and Shelley refused. And then another man, he wanted to take down the sail, but Shelley wouldn't let Edward Williams do so, even though Edward Williams was a former Royal Naval officer, would have known what he was doing. They didn't come home that night, and his family grew frantic, travelled all along the coast. Of course, it was often faster to sail in those days than go over those bumpy, ill-repaired roads, and asking in every fishing village, was there any news of them? But there'd been no sighting. Obviously, there are very, very few Britons in the area, so they really stood out. And it's 10 days later that their cadavers were washed ashore at Viareggio, which is halfway between Livorno and San Terzeno. Anyway, so they were buried in the sand where they were found, according to the local regulations. Their bodies were disinterred about 4 weeks later, well, a bit more than 4 weeks later, actually. And the authorities permitted this, but they had to be cremated there and then for sanitary reasons. And as you can imagine, their bodies were in an advanced state of decomposition. It was a ghastly scene. So Lord Byron was there, so was Leigh Hunt and Edward John Trelawney. It was a very hot August day, so they must have been absolutely reeking. Shelley's corpse was hugely bloated. He was recognisable only by the clothes and the fact that he had a copy of Keats's Lamia in his pocket. As Lord Byron said, that the body might as well have been a sheep. So then the ashes were taken, held by the British consul at Rome for a few months before buried in Cimitero a Cattolico in Rome, almost in the very walls of ancient Rome, the city which had inspired so much of Keats's oeuvre. But the heart had been snatched from the burning embers by Edward John Trelawney. Shelley had a heart condition which probably made it more difficult for his heart to combust. And then Leigh Hunt had the heart. It was wrapped up in a page of Keats's noble prose, preserved in alcohol and kept for decades. At long last he gave in and handed the heart to Shelley's widow, Mary Shelley, the authoress of Frankenstein. And eventually his heart was buried at Bournemouth in the United Kingdom. So that is Percy Bysshe Shelley, who died at the age of only 29, but his contribution to world literature is really incomparable. The author of so many plays, as well as numerous poems, he was a particularly gifted sonetist, many very persuasive redactions, The Necessity of Atheism, and a rather longer, more mature version of that, A Refutation of Deism, The Vindication of a Natural Diet, An Address to the Irish People, A Defence of Poetry, and so forth, in which he most memorably said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. So Percy Bysshe Shelley's oeuvre is one of life's most inappreciable benisons, and his work is celebrated and enjoyed all across the globe, and not only in English but also in translation. He's fairly popular in English. He was a radical, and that's why Owenists and Chartists held him to be their idol for many decades after he died. Ozymandias, perhaps his most widely appreciated poem, gives its name to a character in Tripods, that futuristic sort of horror, I suppose you could call it, dystopian novel. And that's when I first became aware of one about 10 years old. So Shelley's life was short. It was filled with grief, but it was not a life of unremitting gloom. He always lived very well, had at least a middle-class standard of living, despite sometimes being insolvent, but always managed to raise loans on the strength of the inheritance that he never actually lived to inherit. He had 7 children, at least 3 of whom predeceased him. So he was married twice. Despite being a principled opponent of matrimony, he had numerous mistresses. He was a romantic in every sense. If he was in love with someone, he would just start a relationship with that person. He was one of the first apostles of free love, but then that also meant infidelity. So he was a problematic character, quite complex, in a way lacking in empathy, not thinking that these rules might exist for a good reason, to stop people getting hurt. So he was definitely a free thinker, an apostle of liberty and equality, but he didn't give much of his wealth, or any of his wealth really, to the needy. So in some ways he was egotistical, self-centered. He led a very peripatetic and perhaps bohemian lifestyle, traveling around Italy, never living in any one place for more than 6 months. His plays were almost never performed. He didn't go to the theatre very much. He was not prone to extroversion. He did attend a few soirées hosted by Lord Byron, who seemed to be the unofficial leader of Shelley's circle. But Shelley went along to a few of those. But Shelley was increasingly retreating into reclusion and mania in the last few months of his life. Seemed to have a curious presentiment he was going to die, haunted by these terrible nightmares and so forth. Often seeing a vision of his own face, his doppelganger, and things like that. Thinking that he'd been physically assaulted. He was quite often delusional. So he'd been known as Mad Shelley, mercilessly mocked as a schoolboy at Eton. But perhaps his tormentors were onto something. He was not quite all there, Percy Bysshe Shelley, the only person besides his grandfather and his son to bear the name Bysshe. Well, Bysshe was actually a surname. His grandfather's Christian name, a family name on his great-great-grandmother's side. So that's him, someone who's entranced me all my life. But many of his works, like Queen Mab and the Cenci, are too long and perhaps turgid for people to enjoy these days. He was heavily influenced by Edmund Spenser, which is why he wrote about fairies. So he was an outspoken atheist, even that redounded very much to his disadvantage. But yet he couldn't think of any other metaphors apart from supernatural ones. So often Prometheus bound. Often his poems were reworkings of classical themes. Obviously, there was the Greek ancient myth of Prometheus. There was Prometheus Bound by John Milton, and so on. But he did find his own voice. Even when he addressed himself to jaded themes, he never wrote in a hackneyed style. He was innovative. He was bold. But he managed to enjamb imagery with meter and rhyme so masterfully. So it's difficult to say what his most popular work is. Probably Ozymandias. Adonais, by some people's measure, that monody for Keats is perhaps his magnum opus. But what do you think? Anyway, thank you so much for watching this. There is a Keats-Shelley association, but they're doing nothing here in Italy for his death. I thought there'd be some ceremony at Livorno, where his fatal voyage set out from, or Viareggio, where his corpse was cremated at the so-called English cemetery in Rome, but none of that's happening. Thank you very much for watching. Toodaloo.